Even though Woodrow Wilson, again, tries to be as as peaceable about all of these concessions as he possibly can, tries to be as amiable as he can about this, all the other powers that be are not willing to play nice. Okay, and also Woodrow Wilson's attention to the war is absolutely devastating for the U.S. in terms of domestic politics, because he is actually at the Paris Peace Conference for a total of 6 months during 1918, and it alienates him from the American people and from American politics in general. He tries to basically look over his shoulder in all this and to get America to elect a Democratic Congress to support all of his ideas. Unfortunately, though, the American public is not willing to side with him here. Okay, they wanted to keep out of this for the most part, and they're not willing to listen. Teddy Roosevelt actually even criticizes him in saying that electing a Democratic Congress is, quote, a cruel insult to every Republican father or mother whose sons have entered the Army or Navy. And Roosevelt is grieving here because one of his sons, I believe Kermit, his son, was a member of the U.S. Navy and was actually killed during the war. Okay, so Roosevelt has just as much of an axe to grind as many other Americans. And despite Wilson's efforts to keep the Democrats in power, the Democrats lose both the House and the Senate. So now all of Congress is effectively put in a stance against Wilson in terms of how this treaty is going to go. And again, this treaty is going to require a 2/3 Senate majority vote in favor of it for it to be ratified. Okay, and now that the Republicans control it, it's virtually guaranteed that this is not going to go his way. And he's very obstinate about keeping power here. He refuses to appoint a Republican to the peace delegation because he thinks that they're going to challenge his authority. Okay? Most Americans expect Henry Cabot Lodge, the leading Republican in Congress, to be appointed to this. But instead, Wilson appoints Henry White, a guy who used to be a diplomat under Roosevelt, okay? Simply because he wants to do it and because he doesn't want the American people to tell him what to do. And when Wilson actually does come to Europe and actually sees the European people, they greet him as a hero and as a savior, and it actually fuels this sense of self-righteousness in him more and more and just makes him that much more obnoxious. On the other hand, though, the people who are actually in charge of these European nations are not thrilled to see Wilson at all. They don't like his politics. They don't like his approach to things, this whole moralist stance and so forth, trying to impose American Christian democracy values on everybody. They absolutely despise him. And so the Paris Peace Conference actually, I beg your pardon, I said it was in 1918. It's in 1919, from January to June, the first 6 months. Germany, Austria-Hungary, and the Ottoman Empire are all effectively destroyed by this war. Okay, they have not really any kind of provisional governments to fall back on necessarily, except for Germany, which actually does create a small one for a while. And Europe in general is absolutely destroyed in terms of its economy, in terms of any kind of enforcement of laws. Right? No one is watching anybody. Okay, so there's massive migrations, there's lawlessness, starvation, poverty. I mean, everything that you can imagine. The entirety of mainland Europe is essentially falling apart. And especially now that the Russian Revolution has occurred and these power vacuums are in place, it could be way too easy for some kind of a revolution to occur and potentially for communism to come in and take control. Okay, so this is kind of the beginning of the rest of the world becoming paranoid about the communist presence. And so there's a tall order here. Okay, these 4 delegates that you see here in the background have to completely restructure Europe and part of the Middle East as well. And they're nicknamed the Big Four because they represent the 4 major allied nations that are involved in this particular conflict. Again, Woodrow Wilson, of course, is the head of the United States. And Wilson's entire motivation here is to push the idea of a League of Nations, right? To try to settle international disputes and to prevent this type of thing from happening again. And he likes the idea of imposing military and economic sanctions, but he only wants it to go so far. Okay, he's probably the most lenient of the group. And he thinks that there is a possibility that if this League of Nations thing can actually work, then it could prevent all future wars altogether, that we can prevent the need for military intervention. And again, it's extremely idealistic, right? It's extremely naive, unfortunately, in many cases. And again, the Republican Party in the United States is already working against Woodrow Wilson. Okay, the Congress in general thinks that this is too idealistic, it's too risky, and that it could potentially damage the sovereignty of the United States. Okay, that it could subject itself to a foreign power, and that we could essentially lose power as a nation. France has Georges Clemenceau, okay, the little fellow who you see here in the background with the mustache. Clemenceau is nicknamed the Tiger, okay, for pretty obvious reasons, because he, more so than anybody else, absolutely detests Woodrow Wilson, okay? Even though it's kind of funny, you see him here kind of smiling at the camera in the background. Woodrow Wilson is standing next to him. He's probably thinking bad thoughts about Wilson. He hates Wilson, and he, more than anybody else, is out for blood when it comes to Germany. Okay, he wants Germany to pay for everything that they've done here, for all of the aggression that they've enacted on everybody else. Great Britain has as its prime minister David Lloyd George. And David Lloyd George, this is Italy's prime minister, Vittorio Orlando, sorry about that. David Lloyd George's whole idea here is to try to weaken Germany as much as possible, okay? Specifically by placing harsh provisions on them, economic sanctions, military sanctions. So Britain and France are really working side by side more than anybody else here to try to enact as harsh a punishment as possible on Germany. Italy, under Vittorio Orlando, is really there more so than anything to, unfortunately, as bad as it sounds, to be an opportunist. Okay, he believes that Italy is going to gain something out of this now that they picked the right side in the conflict, and so Wilson is kind of the odd one out here, right? He's the only one who seems to have his own agenda, and no one else really is listening to him. And what we ultimately come out with is something called the Treaty of Versailles. Okay, this is the treaty that ultimately ends World War I and has a long-term ripple effect that continues to send Europe and the United States in a downward spiral toward World War II. Okay. And again, because Wilson has such a large loss of Senate approval, because the United States Congress is not on his side because they're Republicans, they're not Democrats, he loses a lot of authority in his negotiations, okay? Because his own country is turning against him, the other individuals involved are not really willing to listen to him either. Most of the European negotiators continue to downplay the idea of self-determination, right? They still are clinging to the idea of imperialism more than anything else because it's made them a lot of money, okay? And because now, perhaps more than ever, they need that money in order to be able to rebuild their economies. Okay? Germany has to yield a lot of territory of itself to France and to Poland. And the countries of Austria, Hungary, Poland, Yugoslavia, and Czechoslovakia are all created in Central Europe as a direct result. This takes the Austro-Hungarian Empire and divvies it up into these 5 different countries. Okay. And along the Baltic Sea, we have the countries of Finland, Estonia, Lithuania, and Latvia all created as well. So now, out of all of this, okay, we now have, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10 new nations that are created in the aftermath of World War I. Okay, all divvied up from essentially 2 or 3 major empires that are now gone. Okay, so this is a dramatic change. And again, we have completely redrawn the map of Europe now. And all of the colonial holdings that the Central Powers had, okay, when they had control of certain places in Africa and Southeast Asia and all over Europe, all of those are now divvied up as the spoils of war among the Allies. Okay, all the African and Turkish territories are divided up among France and Great Britain. Japan starts to take control of a lot of German colonies in East Asia. Remember, Japan, even though it hasn't really had a presence in this conflict, okay, it's had the patronage of Great Britain. Okay, Great Britain has given it all the technology, the naval advancements, and so forth, so it gets a share of the spoils as well. Germany is forced ultimately to accept full responsibility for the war and its expenses, okay? Because Germany is the one that is essentially been the major aggressor in this conflict, okay? And the total amount is $33 billion in the standards of the time, okay? So that's not adjusted for inflation. That's a lot. And what we have here is something that is referred to as the war guilt clause. Okay, and that's the primary thing that most of the countries involved here want to see happen, is for Germany to essentially humble itself and claim responsibility. And the war guilt clause is actually invented by an American politician named John Foster Dulles. Okay, and Dulles actually has a very long-term engagement in U.S. politics, beginning with the Treaty of Versailles and going all the way through the Cold War. He's actually very much a hardliner for American sovereignty, pushing the envelope and so forth. So you'll see him again several times. And it takes Germany all the way until 2010 before they actually fully repay the Allied powers for World War I. Okay, so they've only been out of debt with us for just over a decade now. And the treaty is presented to the German delegates with these little contingencies in May of 1919, and is returned 3 weeks later with 443 pages of criticism about how much they do not like it. Okay, and this is an instance where there really is an impasse. Okay, Germany and Austria-Hungary are not willing to accede to this, and the Allies turn around, and the French in particular say, if you do not sign this in the way that we have it now, we are going to restart the war with Germany. Okay, we are going to restart the war, we're going to come after you, and we are going to destroy you. And so, under duress, the Treaty of Versailles is signed by the German delegates finally, okay, in June of 1919. The Ottoman Empire is another strange little wild card here, because again, the Ottoman Empire has been in existence since 1299. Okay, very, very long-standing, very old empire, and it's essentially a conglomerate of several Middle Eastern nations that all essentially are united under the flag of Islam. Okay, the Ottoman Empire ends up allying with the Central Powers in 1914, kind of again as a response to European imperialism. Okay, this is again, another one of those responses to that. In 1916, okay, an individual named Hussein ibn Ali al-Hashimi, I beg your pardon, he's the Sharif and the Emir of Mecca, which is, the words Sharif and Emir are both noble titles. He's basically like, kind of like a local king, okay, of Mecca. And Mecca is one of the primary locales of Islam. It's a holy site in Saudi Arabia. Okay. He agrees that he is going to lead a revolt against the Ottoman Empire from within to weaken it and cause it to collapse. Okay. He's essentially agrees to do this on behalf of the Allies. And the British make a deal with him, specifically saying that we are going to allow you self-determination. We're going to give you an Arab state as an independent country when the war is over. Okay. And very quickly, the British end up going back on this deal. Okay. But as a direct result of what al-Hashimi ends up doing, the Ottoman army ends up falling to the Allies in Mesopotamia, and Mesopotamia is modern-day Iraq, and the Suez Canal in Egypt. Okay, so because of this little sense of espionage that ends up happening here, right, the Ottoman Empire ends up falling apart from within. And immediately after the war is over, the British go back on their promise. Okay, and they enact something that they call the mandate system. And the mandate system is basically just a thinly disguised form of imperialism. Okay, they take all of the territories of the Ottoman Empire and they divide them up over among the Allied powers who end up winning the war. And so, like you see here on the map, we have a dissolution of the Ottoman Empire through what's called the Treaty of Sèvres in 1920. Okay, and this allows the Allies to occupy this little section of the Middle East here called the Anatolian Peninsula. Okay, so all these different little areas here are divided up and given over to certain allies. The British take control of Mesopotamia, again modern-day Iraq, which you see here, and Palestine. Okay, Palestine is part of which is eventually turned over to Israel as time progresses. The French take control of Syria. And Turkey, which you see up here in this in this green portion up here at the top, Turkey is actually occupied by Turkish nationalists who, again, we see this pushback against imperialism by nationalists, led by a general named Mustafa Kemal Ataturk. Okay, and Ataturk actually leads a revolution immediately after World War I ends against the Allied powers to push them out of the way. It's the Turkish War for Independence. And the Allied powers are so weakened by what's happened with the First World War that they give in relatively quickly. And we end up with the Treaty of Lausanne, which recognizes a secular independent republic of Turkey. Okay? And this is, again, something dramatically different from what was already there, because remember, this was part of the Ottoman Empire. It was an Islamic caliphate is essentially what it was, right? It was an Islamic empire. And so now this specific group has separated itself off and has become a secular independent republic, right? Has tried to basically say we're not going to endorse one religion or another. It's a dramatic change. And so, again, the Middle East ends up being divided up like this for a long period of time, even into parts of the 20th century where it continues to be, a point of contingency. And there are certain areas here that don't really get touched by all this. Again, Saudi Arabia, even though it does gain independence by 1923, right? Al-Hashimi does manage to get that. Other places like Kuwait and Iran, which up until 1935 is referred to as Persia, okay, are all kind of distant enough from all this where they're not affected yet. But again, the Ottoman Empire ceases to exist after 1922. As for Woodrow Wilson himself, okay, he gets involved in trying his best for the remainder of his life to get the Senate to approve the Treaty of Versailles. Okay, he tries to get them to vote on the treaty, and the Republicans denounce his dedication to the idea of a League of Nations. Okay, they do exactly what the Republicans would think to do in this case, in that they are concerned that it's going to threaten American independence. They're concerned that it's going to make America too beholden to a foreign power. Okay, if we grant too much to them, we're going to lose our sovereignty as a nation. And there's two groups of individuals individuals, I guess, who do not necessarily support American membership in the League for certain reasons. There's 14 Republicans and 2 Democrats who are referred to as irreconcilables. They don't want us to be involved in the League. Right? There's no changing their minds. And there's some, though, that are saying we can be involved, but we have to limit our participation. Okay, we have to approve the treaty through certain revisions. Okay, and these are called reservationists. And the idea of the reservationists, the one thing that they want more than anything else, is they want any kind of American involvement in wars through the League of Nations to be approved by the Senate. Okay, they want the Senate to be to basically fulfill its promise and what it does in the Constitution. Wilson, though, gets so fed up with the Senate that rather than waiting for them to vote on it, he bypasses them altogether and goes directly to the American people. He ends up going on a 10,000-mile campaign all over the United States, this little whistle-stop campaign, visits 29 cities in 22 days, and delivers 32 speeches trying to get the American people to vote on his behalf for the treaty to pass. And he works himself to the point to where he collapses from a migraine in September of 1919, forcing him to stop the trip. Okay, he works himself into sickness, essentially. A week later, he ends up suffering a stroke. Okay, and this stroke is really the beginning of the end for Woodrow Wilson, because it ends up paralyzing the left side of his body. Okay, and so now, effectively, he is physically disabled. And you see the photograph of him here in the background. This is actually a rare photograph taken of him after he has the stroke. Okay, his face is beginning to droop a bit on the left side over here. And his condition is actually kept a secret from the American public for the remainder of his term. He withdraws from public life and basically goes into seclusion in the White House for a long time, and the American people don't know what's happened to him. And throughout all this, he is absolutely falling apart as a human being. He has several emotional breakdowns. He suffers from paranoia. He's obviously physically disabled now. And in the midst of all this, he refuses to relinquish his power. Okay, by all rights, it could be very easy for a certain article of the Constitution to be passed in order for a transfer of power to happen because the president is no longer able to do it. Henry Cabot Lodge comes in and tries to revise the treaty, leads to a final vote in 1920. And despite two different drafts of this treaty, it still fails to pass. Okay, so despite all of his efforts, despite him basically working himself to death, Woodrow Wilson does not ever fully pass his version of the Treaty of Versailles. And it takes until 1921 for a joint resolution to absolutely end the war, because we have to sign separate peace treaties with Germany, with Austria, and with Hungary individually in order to bring all this to a close. And it's considered to be Woodrow Wilson's greatest failure as a president, as a politician, and he, even though he wins the Nobel Peace Prize for all this, for doing his very best to try to make sure that America and the world can have a peaceable coexistence, it still doesn't go the way that he wants. To make matters worse, okay, as if things weren't bad enough, after the war ends, after the peace delegations end up falling apart and all these different complications come through and we finally end up with a peace treaty, in the midst of all that, in spring of 1918, a pandemic called the Spanish flu ends up wiping out a significant number of people in the world. Okay, and this is considered to be the fastest spreading pandemic in modern history. Okay, it only lasts a year, but it kills somewhere between 20 and 50 million people across the world, and in some cases, some statistics go as high as 100 million. And a lot of these are individuals who have survived the war. Right? They may have even served in combat. They have managed to get their families out of the way, and then they are cut down by disease after the fact. Okay, so this is and this is still in the midst of the period where there is not really a treatment for the flu yet. Okay, there's no inoculation to speak of. Okay, so it has to essentially run its course. And because of the sheer number of people who are moving all over the world at this point, right, it spreads dramatically faster. Okay, the sheer number of immigrants coming from Europe to the United States to try to get away from all the horrible aftermath of the war, it brings it to the United States as well. And anytime a major war like this ends up coming to an end, I always liken it to someone coming up and kicking an ant mound. Okay, if you live in Texas, you see fire ants, you know exactly what I'm talking about. If you kick a fire ant mound, right, one that's absolutely intact, right, the ants go everywhere. Okay, they scatter all over the place. They're just panicking. They don't know what to do. Okay, and so that's essentially what it's like after a major war happens. Okay, the population of the world and of Europe scatters just like an ant mound does. Okay, and people go all over the place. The United States experiences 675,000 deaths total in the course of a year. Okay, and it gets so bad that there are hospital beds and even coffins go into a severe decline. People can't build coffins fast enough for the sheer number of people who are dying. Okay. And again, it's the fastest killing outbreak of any disease in human history. Okay, and before or since, even with things like we see today with Ebola, with the coronavirus, with all those things. Even considering all that, the Spanish flu is the worst. In spring of 1919, Congress decides to pass the 19th Amendment, finally granting women universal suffrage. Okay, and it finally becomes an official thing on August 19th of 1920, just in time for the 1920 election. And in that election, women count for 40% of the vote in the United States. Okay, so this is a dramatic number and dramatic coming out of women to vote, to be able to exercise their right. And in the same year, in 1919, there's more than 4 million wage workers that end up participating in roughly 3,600 strikes in the United States. It's about 20% of the workforce. And the problem with organized labor now is that in the aftermath of the communist revolution in Russia, each one of these movements is now tainted by the association with that, because a lot of individuals who are involved in organized labor are socialist sympathizers. Some of them might be openly communist sympathizers. Okay, but if you're involved in one of these strikes, it could be that you are not hired back at all, and that perhaps even legal action is pursued after you, because people want to know if you're an actual physical threat or not. And within all these strikes, there are several different instances that get so out of hand that even in September of 1919, the Boston Police Department goes on strike. Okay? And it takes Calvin Coolidge, the governor of Massachusetts, to call out the National Guard to actually maintain order. And he actually has most of the individuals fired from after they do this. Okay? He says that you have no right to deprive the public of protection just because you don't like your pay or whatever. And of course, race riots are another big reality in post-World War I America. Like I said before, because of the sheer number of people who have departed from factory assignments, right? Again, about 4 million men have gone off to fight. Not very many of them have come back. Okay? But the ones who do come back realize that perhaps their jobs have been taken by women, have been taken by African Americans, have been taken by Mexican Americans at some point. And so there's tons of harsh pushback in all this. And again, the Great Migration that we saw from 1917 into the 20s is in direct correspondence with this. So there's tons of white resentment, some of it misplaced, quite a bit of it misplaced. Okay, they may be resentful of the fact that they don't have a job when they come back, but when it comes to violence and killing, there's really no excuse for it. And in 1919 alone, there were 25 separate race riots. And in the South, there are 80 lynchings. 11 of those victims are war veterans. Okay, so this is, even though individuals have served in the armed forces, they've protected the country's interests, its population, it still is no guarantee that they are going to survive all this. Okay, so America has such a long way to go at this point. And again, all the labor strikes that are occurring during this time period are blamed on two particular groups, the communists and the anarchists. Okay? Anarchists don't really have as much of a presence now as they did in the 19th century, I beg your pardon. Communists, though, are gaining more and more traction because of the precedent that's been set in Russia. And people in America are becoming more frightened of communist infiltration than they are of Germany. Okay, they're not really so concerned that Germany is going to ramp up production and start attacking us again. They're worried more about communism. And in 1919, the Secret Service actually uncovers a plot by anarchists in Spain to try to assassinate Woodrow Wilson even. So the anarchists, even though they do largely go out of public appearance, by the time the 20th century comes around, there are still one or two isolated incidents. And there are several instances where mail bombs are being sent out. Okay, this is the first time we start to see this type of domestic terrorism really begin to come about. Okay, and a lot of them are sent to government officials. One of whom is the U.S. Attorney General. His house is bombed, I think, 2 different times, and he is the one who coins the term "Red Menace." Okay, and Red Menace refers specifically to communists. In August of 1919, Palmer actually appoints a young J. Edgar Hoover, who you see here, to create and lead a brand new government division that is designed to collect any kind of information it can on radicals in the government, in the American population, and to deport them. This is the Federal Bureau of Investigation, the FBI. He sets up 250,000 separate informers in 600 cities. And by 1919, November, there have been 450 alien quote-unquote radicals that have been rounded up and deported to Russia. Whether or not they were actually radicals is up for debate. Okay. By January of 1920, 5,000 more suspects are arrested in American cities. Some of them are deported, some of them are imprisoned. And most of the time, the citizens are jailed for coming out in favor of Vladimir Lenin, for downplaying the U.S., for criticizing the government. Again, a lot of the same espionage and sedition acts that we talked about. Okay, they're still arresting people for this. Finally, when we get into the after effects of the Great War, okay, Europe has been absolutely destroyed. Again, there is no real saving grace for Europe as this self-stylized center of Western culture anymore. Okay? All of that culture has been wiped out for the most part, or has been damaged beyond repair. And so everything from cities to certain populations of people, entire economies, and 4 separate European empires have been destroyed altogether. And the Germans and the Austrians themselves are the ones who are the most resentful of the Treaty of Versailles. They are the ones who have such a long-term axe to grind. And it's in this particular time period that a former German corporal named Adolf Hitler resurrects what is called the Nationalistische Deutsche Arbeiterpartie. This is the German Workers' Party, is what it's called. And they shorten the name, nickname them Nazis, the Nazi Party. Okay, and Nazis comes from nationalistisch, which just means nationalists. Okay, so again, this is allegedly beginning to materialize as a nationalist movement against imperialism. Okay, trying to target the Allies and the United States as imperialists, but at the same time too, it's trying to at first anyway, it comes across as a way to reclaim some kind of dignity for the German people. Okay. Over time, though, of course, it morphs into exactly what we know it to be, a horrible, horrible regime bent on human destruction and all kinds of horrible things. The Bolshevik Revolution ends up leading to a reorganization of Russia altogether, along with certain other nations that it ends up absorbing into itself over time. And it refers to itself as the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics, the USSR. Okay, so it begins doing this in 1922, and the USSR exists as an entity in the world all the way until 1990. Okay, all throughout the Cold War, the USSR is the U.S.'s primary enemy. And for the very first time, America emerges as the dominant world power. Okay, it has a supreme advantage here, economically speaking, at least for a short while. Okay, and we haven't gotten to the Great Depression yet. We're only a few years away from it. But now the U.S. is a major creditor to most of the European powers. Okay, we are the one who holds all of the money. We're the one who holds all of the credit bills. And we have a lot of authority, more so than we ever have. And over the course of the next couple of decades, we'll start to see exactly how well we end up handling that.